Okay.
Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to the next episode of the Releasing the Review show, where we talk about everything related to health, well-being, nutrition, weight loss, and whatever else that we can think of when it comes to ourselves and looking after ourselves in the best way. And today I'm really excited because I have a bit of a different guest today. I've got with me Elaine Boddy, who is a sourdough guru. And I met Elaine, I was introduced to Elaine 2 years ago during lockdown, when everyone was suddenly starting to bake. I did as well. And I started baking some sourdough. I was failing. Well, I think the first few loaves came out quite okay. But then afterwards, summer hit and all my loaves were failing. And I really thought at some point that all I was going to be stuck with is baking sourdough bagels. And then my friend Karine introduced me to Elaine, or to Elaine's group. And that's how I got involved with the community that Elaine built, but also with her group. Now, Elaine, welcome, first of all.
Hi, thanks for having me
here. And tell me a little bit about you and how you got into baking, and especially sourdough baking, because I think you came from somewhere a little bit different background before.
Yeah, it really, there was no kind of fantastical, learning at my mother's apron strings or anything like that. I had started a food blog. I had started to teach myself how to cook my favorite foods, and my favorite foods tend to be Middle Eastern based. They're my choice of flavors. And as I started to teach myself to cook these foods, I decided to start a food blog, of which I had no idea. Just pressed the button and made up a name, which is where Foodbod came from, and started to track the things that I was making. So we have the same mug as you. And within that, you suddenly become part of this amazing community, this community of home cooks, home bakers, people just sharing what they're doing. And I tried making bread, lots of things with dried yeast, with fresh yeast. And someone challenged me to make sourdough. And honestly, I'd never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it was anything special. And probably that was maybe a good thing in reflection, because therefore I had no fear. It was just this other way of making bread. And my friend Selma sent me some dried starter and some information, and this list of instructions, which I kind of looked at and thought, put that to one side for a bit, until she hassled me to have a go. And I followed the instructions. I revived the starter. I made my first loaf, and it was just amazing. It was amazing. I had this big bowl of dough. I had this starter, this thing bubbling away. I created this, which was pretty good, first loaf, actually. I ignored all the rules. I cut straight into it. I ate half of it in one go, like I do. And it went from there. And it was only because of just having a go. And I then started to realize there was lots of things to read about it, lots of different things you could do with it. And then started to experiment. I started to make my own starter and try different things. So really, I only started making it because it came from a challenge.
Which is always a good thing, really. You know, when you're challenged to do something, you kind of generally just go and do it because you want to be successful at it.
Yeah, and actually going in blindly was a good thing.
Yeah,
because I wasn't in Facebook groups, I wasn't looking at stuff online. And I think as soon as you start to get into that, that's where people often end up just disappearing down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And it gets overwhelming and confusing because there's so much information. So actually, I only then rejoined Facebook and started to look at stuff online once I'd figured things out for myself. Once actually I'd created my own way of doing things, and I was consistently making my own loaves, and I was comfortable with what I was doing, did I then start to join the conversation about it? And actually, it's the first time I've really made that realization. Actually, I benefited from that. When I see how many people I help nowadays who have got caught in that web, actually, the fact that I wasn't, I think was quite beneficial.
I mean, just the fact that you weren't comparing your bread with someone else's bread and your starter with, I mean, it's like anything, you know, the minute we do things for ourselves and we find out what works for us, it's so much easier than starting to compare. Oh, it works for them, why doesn't it work for me, etc.
And I didn't realize that there was this whole thing going on, actually, that there was this whole community and all of these discussions, and that there was this kind of sourdough police element of people that are so fixated on how it should be and how it should look and things like that. And actually, I'm really happy that I wasn't part of that from the beginning. And I'm quite happy that now I can feel confident and comfortable enough to also question that and undo that for other people. But it's a good way to come to it. I mean, when people contact me and say I've never made bread, I always say, brilliant. Absolutely. That's the best way to come to it, to be honest. So yeah, that's where it came from for me, just by being encouraged by somebody that was enjoying it and thought that I should give it a go.
Well, coming from where you were with food, it definitely, why not? Definitely. But what's interesting really is that I think, and I don't know if it's lockdown or anything else, has given some kind of revival to bread, and you know, up until now, but especially before, bread, wheat and gluten, carbs, all that kind of stuff has such a bad rep that it's quite interesting to see how a revival came up during lockdown and probably beyond, but then people still say that, oh, I should avoid bread, oh, I shouldn't have bread. And so what are your thoughts about you know, wheat, gluten, carbs in general when it comes to potentially health? And
for me, I think it has to be about the versions that you choose and the versions of bread and wheat and carbs that you choose. Now, I come from, as you know, I come from my own background of body issues, food issues. You know, I've had to work very hard to find a point of peace with myself and the food that I eat and I choose. And I only eat and choose the foods that benefit me. I am 51 years old. I've been there, done it, tried the diets, done the stupid things. I've done the cycle of it. I have gone through all those processes. I've stuffed my face. I've starved myself. I've done it all. And I'm now at a point where I know what makes me feel good and what doesn't. I know what I want to put in my body. And it's, for me, it is the good choices. So when people say to me, you know, but, you know, gluten's meant to be so bad for you and carbs are so bad for you. No, they're not. There's no health, there's no food group, real food group that's bad for you. It's about the choices you make within it. So whenever people say that to me about sourdough, my answer is, well, firstly, sourdough is the healthiest form of bread you can eat because of the way that it's made. There's a very long process, and that long, slow proving process starts to break down the gluten in it, which makes it a lot more digestible. There's a lot of people that cannot eat any other version of bread without having disturbance in their stomachs that can eat sourdough very happily. You have to excuse me, it's a very sweaty day in the UK.
It's still hot, yeah.
But also, there's the difference of making it yourself. So anything that you make yourself, you therefore know what's in it. So you can make the choices of what you use to go in it. So whether you use a white flour or whole grain flour or whatever choice you make, you're making the choice for yourself rather than a food producer deciding what they're going to put in it for you. So for me, you know, I don't eat white pasta. I don't eat rice. I don't eat those things out of choice because I don't want them and I don't like them, actually, because I've changed my tastes. Years ago, you could have given me a fresh white loaf. I could have eaten a whole lot quite happily. That's not now my choice because of educating myself, changing my palate, but also starting to, since I've done this, starting to learn more. So you can see that if you buy shop-bought bread, it will toast very quickly, partly because there's so little substance to it, but also the sugar in it to help it brown faster.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get that with sourdough. Sourdough takes a long time to toast because you don't have those elements in it. So for me, when I am interviewed and I've been asked these questions about, but why gluten and why carbs and these things are so bad for us, it's about the choices you make and the versions of them you eat. And that's my view on it, that I hope you would agree with, Anne.
100%. Yeah. I mean, for me, everything that's homemade is already better than anything else. That's shop bought for sure. And I grew up in Belgium, where bread was a daily thing. So, there was no such thing as at the time as supermarket bread, which there is now for sure. But we had the baker dropping, bread off on a daily basis or every other day in front of our door with fresh bread. So, so that's kind of, I'm not sure everything was sourdough, but it definitely was better quality than anything we get today, for sure. So yeah, but I remember when I struggled with baking at the beginning, you said to me, well, go back to basic and go back to a white loaf. And I was just like, well, I don't want to eat white bread. And I remember you saying, but white sourdough is 100 times better than the white bread that you buy in the supermarket or anything. So yeah.
And it was also, sorry, then my son just coming and going.
That's okay.
It was also the fact of, because you got to a point where you were struggling with your bread at the time, by just going back to the basics and with some white flour was just to give you the basics and the structure and that starting point with it, to then start to change the flours you were using. So if we start making sourdough with strong white bread flour, already by making our own and making that choice, it's better than what you can buy. But also it gives you a good starting point that you then build on. So now when you look at all the bread that you're making, these lovely seed packed and covered loaves, you now know how your dough is going to behave and what you want to put in it because you've got those basics from the beginning. And too often people come to sourdough, they make their first loaf and then they go, oh, what else can I shove in it? What else can I use? What different flours can I use? Without realizing it's going to make a massive difference to the outcome. So just by getting the basics at the beginning and just understanding how that goes will make it easier for you then to move into the other kinds of flours and adding things to your bread.
Definitely. So talking about different types of flour, obviously there's wheat, we all know. But there's so many different ones: spelt, rye, acorn, emmer, Khorasan, wholemeal, white. What are the differences between them, and especially on a health perspective, probably, or gut health perspective? Do you know anything? Can you share anything on that one?
But the key difference, I think, between a white and a whole grain flour, which is what we're really talking about, is the process of the fact that with a whole grain flour, you've got the wheat germ, you've got the whole grain still in there. So you've got the benefit from that. And there's a lot of nutrients that are then going to be in your flour from those grains. You've got, and that all benefits gut health because they're so positive for it, as much because you've got a good input of fiber. And, a lot of people in the UK don't eat enough fiber. So
it's interesting, isn't it? Because people think they do because they eat a lot of bread and they eat a lot of, but the bread that they eat just doesn't have the fiber in it. So they think they do, but there isn't.
And you can't knock white flour completely. In this country it's fortified, so you do have other nutrients in it. But if you want to get even more, then going into the whole grains and ancient grains does make a difference. You will also get, the added flavour. if you want a more sour loaf, by adding whole grain flour, we'll do that. And by whole grains, we can mean whole wheat, we can mean wholemeal, we can mean ancient grains. So you get that added extra. You might also make it more filling, you know, and one of the things that when we're looking after our health and our diet and, you know, our bodies, if we can be eating something that's a bit more filling, it also helps us. And, you know, with sourdough, even if you have a straight loaf made with strong white bread flour, one single slice of that has the same amount of protein as an egg, a standard egg. Yes, it's a different kind of protein because it's gluten protein as opposed to animal protein, but I've actually done this measurement and it ends up at something like 6 grams of protein. So there's still that added extra element. And as we're all told, protein is more filling. So you've got that extra benefit. So when you then start to add the whole grains to it, you know, you then build that even more. So if we want to go back to the beginning, our first ever grain was einkorn, which is what this is. Tiny little grains. They were the first grains that our forefathers had that they would make bread with. When it's milled, it can be quite soft, it can be quite yellow. It makes a beautiful, beautiful loaf, but it's a flour, all of these flours, it's a flour that won't hold its shape. So it benefits from having other things in the dough to give it some stability, whether that is a portion of white flour, a portion of wholemeal flour, or maybe some seeds.
Or baked in a tin.
Or baked in a tin. Yeah. As soon as you give it some structure, you don't need to worry about anything else. So you went from your einkorn, which is this, into Emma. And if you look at the two together, there's not a lot of difference other than size. The Emma is more pink and might be a bit more granular. And then you got into spelt. And we know spelt a bit more, that's a bit more common, what people see. But also you then had the Coruscant. Coruscant is a lot more yellow and a lot grainier and can drink a lot of water. So these are all what you would call your ancient grains, or sometimes they're called heritage flours. But these were the earliest harvested grains for making flour.
So when you say ancient or heritage, is that because they've been less touched by, you know, being industrialized, or
literally they're thousands of years old originally because they were the first, but a lot of the growers that now grow them also try to keep it, try to respect the way that they were grown and processed in the past as well. So they do try to also process them less. So again, that's why they will often have less structure and why we get so much of the goodness from them. So for me, I like the grains as they are. If I was going to have a dish with a grain in or something, I would have these. I would cook these instead of having pasta or rice or something like that. These would be the basis of my meals. And they have a lovely chew and a lovely flavour. So even whole, they're lovely. They're great in bread. If you have some left over, shove them in your dough. But if you also buy the flours, which we now have a lot more access to, you've got so much benefit from the fact that they are whole grain, that you've got all of that goodness coming from them. And you will find different flavour profiles, however slight, they will give you some different flavour profiles, and they make lovely starters, really textured starters. And of course, rye. I don't have any rye here, but also that does the job too.
So where does that wheat come from then? The wheat that we know or that we kind of eat on a regular basis?
The wheat that we have now?
Yeah.
Merely, I mean, I'm still learning on this one, and I'm being educated by Bertie on this one, who's the managing director of Cotswold Flour. And it's really, I think it's taken over because it became the wheat that was the easiest to harvest, that was the easiest to grow, the easiest for them to process. But also, you know, it became very fashionable, like in Victorian times, to have very white bread. So, you know, we can look back to even that time for when, you know, white was king. And the funny thing is, for them to make it that white, they often put all sorts of things in it to make it, you know, bleach it as white as possible. Whereas it was the poor people that were being given all of the other grains like these, and, you know, the whole grain bread, which is crazy, really. But you therefore, when you go back to the industrial era and you look at what was being processed more, you know, that's where a lot of these things come from. But this was also about feeding England and finding what's the cheapest and easiest and fastest way to do things. So the wheat that created those white flours, that's why it's become so much more popular. And that idea of white bread and what we were brought up with and that kind of thing has continued to boost that, because it's about supply and demand, isn't it? So it's about, you know, what's easiest to grow, what's easiest to manage and maintain, what creates a better yield. And those standard wheats do. These wheats are different to grow. They don't have as much of a yield and more expensive to grow. They're different to process. So it comes down to the farming as well, and, you know, what farmers can produce and make their money from, you know, and we all know how much farmers are struggling. So it's the balance, isn't it?
Very interesting. So another question when it comes to flour, organic versus non-organic. What I know that, you know, in nutrition they do say there's certain things that you have to have organic, while there's other things that it's fine not to have. Obviously, with all the pesticides they put on things, does it make a difference or not, or is it more important on how a farmer is processing and harvesting, etc.?
See, that I'm not going to get too much into that one, because this is a much bigger debate. I think I have a mix of organic and non-organic. If I speak to the expert, he tells me actually he thinks what's more important is regenerative farming rather than organic, because if you go through a process of regenerative farming, you're looking at how you feed the earth and how you get the best out of the ground, how you cycle through you growing different things and different wheats to get the best out of the earth. I think
that's a type of, in my opinion, that's kind of a type of organic as such anyway. I mean, you might still use some products that you might not be, you know, that might be manufactured, but it's still a way of keeping the tradition of how it used to be done, as opposed to.
And I think sometimes it has to come down to personal choice and cost and availability, and I think these things can be tied up with so much with the way that food costs are at the moment. I think that people shouldn't be criticised for the choice they make, whether they choose an organic or non-organic. But if we can support farmers as much as possible to help the food supply and help maybe get those costs down eventually, you know, that there's nothing negative about that. Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it?
It definitely is. I mean, I started with just organic flours, and then I moved more now towards, you know, Matthew Cotswold's flours, because as you know, showed me and I tried, I love the feel of it and I love the flavor of it as well. And having seen how they mill the flour, I can say that it's done in a very traditional way as much as possible, even though, yes, there are machines and stuff, but it is in keeping with as much of the traditional way as possible, which is quite.
Yeah, and, you know, I'm not paid by them, sponsored by them or anything like that. I use Cotswold flour because I found them and I started using them and I like them. And yes, now I have someone there that I can speak to. But it does come to that, and there's a lot of mills around the place, but they are a family-run mill. They try to do things as traditionally as possible. They are passionate about how they do these things. And, you know, there's lots of other mills in the country, and actually they're one of the smallest. What I find fascinating, I don't know if Bertie said the same thing to you when you had the mill tour, when we stood on top of the roof of the mill and you're looking out at the whole of the Cotswolds. And he was explaining that years ago, there would have been a mill in every village. So all of the villages are 5 miles apart.
Yeah.
And in every village there would have been its own mill, its own flour mill, because they were milling just for themselves and just for that village. And it was about, you know, transport and, you know, and
Yep.
those mills and those village environments, you know, have all become, so many of them have closed down as industrialization came in, and there's bigger mills and there's the railways. But I think it's fascinating to think of all the village elements.
That's really true, because I remember growing up in Belgium, and you know, when we were traveling to the seaside, you had a windmill in nearly every village, and that's what they were doing. And actually, after I started baking in the first just after the first lockdown, I went back to see my parents the minute I could. And turns out that a colleague of my dad who was working in a hospital bought a mill. And so I went to visit the mill. And it's just incredible. And you do have the train line just next to it. So that was kind of transporting. And it's, you know, small batches that they do there. But it's really interesting how that used to supply the local village and the little villages around, and that's it. Yeah.
And it, you know, I used to live in Holland as a child, and it would be the same. You know, there's the windmills everywhere, but people possibly don't realize what the function of them was. They just see it as a typical, you know, icon from the Netherlands. They see them all over the place. But yes, they would have been doing the same job, wouldn't they? And providing for the villages around them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah, no, it's just because you mentioned about, you know, local meals. I was like, oh yeah, that kind of rings a bell, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. So you wrote already 2 books.
I did.
The first one with lots and lots and lots of different recipes. The second one for anyone, I would say, that is wanting to get into sourdough, with lots of do's, don't do's, what, you know, not just do's, don't do's, but what to expect and how to troubleshoot what's going on for any baker. You got a fantastic Facebook group where everyone is super supportive, because I am as well in a few others where people are not always that supportive. As you mentioned at the beginning, lots of people say this is how you should be doing it and you're doing it all wrong, and things like that. So what's next for you?
Oh, the eternal question.
I know you got one more book coming, maybe more.
There's maybe a group book coming. Yeah.
Okay.
We have with my Facebook group, there's a book coming out that because there's, you know, my Facebook group is such a lovely community. It's one of the smaller Facebook groups, which is perfect. It doesn't need to have 100,000 members. It's a small environment where there's lots of people being supportive and making and doing their own thing. And we've invited them all, everybody in the group, to send in recipes if they wanted to. So I see people taking my recipe and doing things with it and creating their own recipes. So we've invited everybody to send in recipes and create a group book, which will be raising money for a mental health charity, which hopefully will be out in the autumn. And the beauty of that is it's going to be so diverse. You know, it's people from kitchens all over the world and some different ideas. But it gives people an opportunity to have a recipe in a book and be part of, which is really exciting, which I really hope that people like.
But it also gives you a hell of a lot of new recipes to try as well, which is quite exciting.
Yeah, and I think that's it, isn't it? Once you start getting to grips with it, you then go, oh, what can I do with this? And it's, for me, often recipes provide inspiration. You know, if I'm thinking about what I want to do for some dough, you see what someone on the telly might be putting in a dish. I look in my cupboard and see what's jumping out at me. And if you're seeing what someone is doing in a kitchen 3,000 miles away, actually you might go, oh, I fancy that idea. So it's the inspiration, it's the connection, it's the sharing. But I also wanted to celebrate as many people as possible in the group you know, bring us together in this thing. And so I'm hoping actually I'm hoping it will come out really nicely. And then, you know, if it goes well, who knows, maybe we can do another one. But for me, there's always things ticking around. So it's more of a watch this space, really.
Okay, sounds good. So if people want to get hold of you, I know you got a website, and by the way, all the details will be in the notes under the video. But you got a website where you have your master recipe and a few other recipes.
Yep. And as much information as people can want to find. There's lots of hints and tips and help. I'm at the end of an email. If people want to message me, email me. As I've been talking to you, I've seen messages popping up on my screen. You know, I'm happy to answer and help as many people as possible. I don't want people to be in their kitchen in the middle of whatever country worried about what they're doing. The main message being that this is a lot easier than you think. It truly is a lot simpler than you think.
Unless it's 38 degrees in your kitchen.
Yeah, then don't bother baking. No,
I tried that yesterday, and believe me, when I tried to shave the loaf, it didn't feel anything good at all. But somehow it happened this morning.
Yeah, it came out really well.
Not sure why.
You know, from thinking about, you know, the benefits of, you know, maybe for your clients and the choice of bread. I know for me, bread was demonized a lot. It became a real hang up for me, bread. So I stopped myself eating it for many, many years. I trained myself out of eating it because it became one of those things that you could just abuse yourself with. But if you are making and eating something like sourdough, you really are getting the best option, and you will feel fuller. It will be more satiating. It's such a better choice if, you know, if food is a demon or it's an issue or it's something that you need to be friends with. You know, sourdough is a really good choice for making friends with bread again. I know that's worked for me. And it does work to have, you know, smaller versions in your freezer. Make a loaf, let it cool, slice it up, have slices in the freezer.
That's what I do. So I have a slice a day, and you know, I'm very happy, and I love it. Yeah. And I think, as you say, it's easy to eat the whole loaf in one go.
Yes, there is that too. There is that. Although I think with sourdough it would be quite hard to achieve. I could probably try it.
I'm sure I could do it. I mean, I know I love fresh bread, so, you know, freshly baked bread. So for me, it's very easily done.
But I think as well, it's the choices of what you put on it, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, if the butter is half an inch thick, then, you know, maybe not ideal. But then one of the beauties of sourdough, of course, is because it's got holes in, a lot of it drops out. So, you know, you lose a lot of the calories because it's all going to just fall out onto the plate.
Fair enough, which is why I just slice and freeze and just take one slice in a while, which works very well for me. But yeah, I do remember. I definitely agree about, you know, home baking as opposed to or find a bakery where they really, you know, keep tradition if you don't have the time or don't want to bake. I always remember and tell the story during the Olympics, which is going to be 10 years now. I went to the Olympic Park, and I for whatever reason, I forgot my food, and I queued up to buy a sandwich, and I took a picture of the ingredients in the bread. It was just shocking. Stuff that you just wonder when you know how to bake. And, you know, I did bake yeast bread before, and even with yeast, you only have about 3 or 4 ingredients anyway. It's just shocking.
Yeah, and it's, you know, actually, if you make your own sourdough, you'll find as well that it keeps and lasts a whole lot longer than a supermarket loaf, even though they put preservatives in it. So really, if there's a positive way of looking after your health, it's knowing what you're eating and what you're putting in your body. And making sourdough can be done simply. It can fit in with life. It's a lot easier than people make out. And even if you're working full time, it's achievable,
it
or
is. I mean, I saw
and
use the fridge.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
so many ways of doing it. I make batches of rolls for my son, and it all goes in the freezer. So, people think I bake every day. I don't actually. I bake once a week, if that, because I will bake in batches and make sure that I've got backups. So it can be done really, really simply.
It definitely can. So lovely. So website, Facebook group, Instagram, email, you everywhere really.
YouTube, Messenger, yeah. I'm not on Twitter though. I haven't got that far. There's only so many. I am now on TikTok, but very
Oh, there you go. TikTok
in a
is
very
coming.
small, tiny, teeny way. But yeah, and really, if I can help anybody, just get in touch, and have a go.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Elaine. It was, as usual, fantastic to speak to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you for inviting.
Yeah, and so for anyone that liked this episode, press the subscribe button and you will be notified about upcoming episodes. And if you haven't seen the previous episodes, go and check them out now. And I'll see you all next month with the next one. Bye for now.
Bye.